Treachery never strikes with a sudden deafening blast. It creeps into a life through muted, evasive apologies and eyes that refuse to meet your own. Eleanor Vance knew her fiancé's smile more intimately than her own reflection, which was why she noticed the exact moment he ceased offering it to her. She had watched his focus drift past her shoulder, fixing intently upon her dearest companion. Tonight, the grand salon of London's high society gathered with one savage expectation to feast upon her public humiliation. They anticipated a shattered weeping maiden fleeing into the shadows. What they never prepared for was the most formidable duke in the realm, choosing to step into the fray. Rain battered the tall leaded windows of the Vance townhouse, reducing the bustling Mayfair street below to a blurry expanse of slate and mud. Eleanor sat beside the glass, an untouched linen sampler, lying forgotten in her lap. By the uncompromising superficial standards of the ton, she was never deemed an exceptional beauty. Her bone structure was far too sharp, her dark eyes entirely too observant, and her jawline far too resolute. Yet she possessed a distinguished bearing, an enviable inheritance, and an acutely pragmatic mind. For 2 continuous years that had been more than sufficient for Julian Thornton Viscount Westbury. Having grown up on adjacent country estates, their formal betrothal was not forged from the tempestuous poetic passions celebrated in romantic verses, but rather from a tranquil, mutual certainty. They were thoroughly acquainted with one another's habits. Julian insisted on steeping his black tea for precisely 3 minutes. Eleanor favored solitary morning rides across the countryside before the mist evaporated. They represented a sensible, well-matched alliance, or so she had naively assumed. Eleanor pressed her fingertips against the frigid glass. The biting cold seeped into her flesh, anchoring her reeling senses. She retraced the subtle progression of her own quiet dread. It had not begun with a shocking revelation. It began 3 weeks prior during an unbearable afternoon reception at Lady Kingsley's estate. Eleanor had found herself cornered by an ancient dowager, debating the agricultural merits of hothouse peaches, scanning the sprawling lawns in search of Julian. To rescue her from the tedious exchange, she spotted him by the perimeter of the boxwood maze. He was not alone. Cecilia Montgomery stood at his side. Cecilia, blessed with spun gold hair and a lilting laugh that invariably caused every gentleman nearby to lean in closer. Cecilia, who had served as Eleanor's inseparable shadow and confidant since their scraped-knee childhood at age 7, Eleanor had observed them from across the lawn. Julian was leaning in close, his posture turned entirely inward toward Cecilia, creating an intimate barrier against the rest of the gathering. Cecilia stood twirling the ivory handle of her parasol cheeks, flushed crimson, peering up at him through lowered eyelashes. It was a fleeting, microscopic fraction of a second, yet Eleanor recognized the truth instantly. It was the heavy, suffocating gravity of 2 individuals consumed by a desperate urge to touch, restrained only by the public gaze. Eleanor had forced herself to look away. She swallowed the acrid taste rising in her throat, convincing herself it was merely the sour lemonade. She reasoned that she was conjuring ghosts. Cecilia was naturally flirtatious, and Julian was simply being attentive. Yet the rot had set in. In the subsequent weeks, Eleanor watched the tidy order of her existence unravel. Julian's routine calls to the Vance residence grew noticeably brief. He offered hurried excuses regarding rural tenant disputes, late parliamentary sessions, or lingering migraines, all while his eyes restlessly flicked toward the parlor entrance, waiting for a specific visitor who never came. And Cecilia was utterly transformed. The vibrant girl who used to burst into Eleanor's bedchamber unannounced at dawn to dissect the prior evening's ball over toast and marmalade suddenly became impossible to find. On the rare occasions they crossed paths, Cecilia seemed strained to the point of breaking. Her laughter rang shrill and false, her eyes darting away in guilt. She babbled incessantly about silk trims and hem lengths, never uttering a single inquiry about the upcoming wedding. The ceremony was barely a month away. Thick, cream-colored vellum invitations embossed in gold had already been delivered across the city. The dressmaker was placing the final pearls onto Eleanor's bridal train. "Eleanor, darling, are you attending to a word I say?" Eleanor blinked, pulling herself back from the memory. Her mother, Lady Vance, was pacing the drawing-room rug, an aura of frantic anxiety radiating from her delicate frame. "Forgive me, Mother." The rain held my attention. As I was saying, Lady Vance continued, pausing to adjust a crooked silver candelabra on the marble mantelpiece. "The botanist requires an immediate answer regarding the table centerpieces. White gardenias or lilies? Julian mentioned a preference for lilies, did he not?" He did, Eleanor answered, her voice sounding strangely hollow in her ears. Lily's will be acceptable. Wonderful. Her mother let out an exaggerated sigh of relief. Everything is proceeding smoothly. You are to become a Viscountess Eleanor. An ironclad future. I only wish your dear father had lived to witness this day. Eleanor turned her gaze back toward the rain-swept street. A private carriage was rattling to a halt before their entrance, iron-rimmed wheels splashing through muddy troughs. The crest painted upon the carriage door was unmistakable, a stooping falcon, Westbury. Julian was outside. Her stomach plummeted with a sickening cold apprehension. He was not scheduled to call today. Eleanor watched as the footman opened the door and Julian stepped into the heavy rain without waiting for an umbrella. His hair was disheveled, his coat unfastened, and his eyes stayed glued to the wet flagstones. Mother Eleanor said quietly, her fingers gripping the linen in her lap until her knuckles turned ghostly white. Lord Westbury has arrived. Lady Vance gasped, her hands flying to her coiffure. Julian, at this hour? Good heavens, I am in no state to receive callers. Go down and receive him in the morning parlor, Eleanor. Call for tea immediately. I shall join you in a quarter of an hour. Eleanor rose. The embroidery fabric slipped to the floorboards. She left it lying in the dust. She stepped through the doorway with rigid, measured steps, feeling as though she were walking toward a scaffold she had spent years building for herself. The morning room carried the faint, melancholy scent of damp soot and dried lavender. Eleanor took her post near the cold hearth, her hands clasped tightly behind her back to conceal their violent trembling. When the oak door clicked open, Julian did not enter with his accustomed easy charm. He stepped past the threshold like a condemned man entering an iron cell. His complexion was chalky, the skin surrounding his eyes bruised with sleeplessness. His linen cravat was crooked and loosened, a jarring departure from his customary fastidiousness. Eleanor, he uttered, his voice cracking painfully on the syllables. Julian, you are drenched, she observed, gesturing to the rain, clinging to his dark coat. Shall I have Miller take your wet outer layer? No, he swallowed heavily. No, I cannot remain. Eleanor stood frozen. The suffocating stillness in the room stretched taut like an iron wire pushed to its breaking point. She offered no casual pleasantry. She refused to grant him an easy reprieve. Let him choke upon the words. Let him dig his own grave. I am at a loss for how to speak this, he whispered, staring down at the carpet patterns, incapable of meeting her gaze. I have paced my study for 3 sleepless nights trying to find the proper phrasing. Eleanor, there is no gentle way to frame this truth. I am a coward. You are, she agreed with icy precision. Her blunt acknowledgement caused him to flinch. He finally lifted his head, the pathetic, naked guilt in his eyes laid bare. I cannot proceed with our marriage. The sentence hung in the cold air, devastating and immutable. Eleanor registered a bizarre sensation in her chest, not the piercing ache of heartbreak, but the catastrophic structural collapse of her entire reality. The sanctuary she had counted upon, the future she had diligently arranged, all of it disintegrated into dust. The invitations have been dispatched, Julian. The banns have already been read twice in church. Her tone was clinical, detached to the point of freezing. To dissolve the betrothal at this juncture is to ignite a social conflagration that will consume us both. I know, he lunged forward half a step, raising his hands in desperate pleading. Dear God, Eleanor, I know, you have every right under heaven to despise me. I despise my own reflection, but I cannot stand before the altar and swear my soul to you when he strangled on the admission. When you belong entirely to Cecilia, Eleanor finished ruthlessly for him. Julian went the color of cold ash. He stumbled back a step, visibly staggered. You were aware. I am not a fool, Julian. Eleanor's composure fractured, permitting a sliver of raw, venomous fury to bleed through. I observed the way your eyes lingered on her. I noticed how she avoided my company. How long has this betrayal endured? It was never a calculated scheme, Julian pleaded, frantically desperate to salvage some pathetic shred of his honor. I swear before God, Eleanor, we never intended for this to transpire. It was an accident, a chance conversation in a ballroom, an unplanned carriage ride. It overpowered us. We fought against it. Cecilia spent days in tears over the guilt of it all. She loves you dearly. Do not dare sully this room by speaking of her love for me, Eleanor snapped, her voice cracking like the lash of a whip. If she held a shred of love for me, she would be standing beside you this very instant. Instead, she sends you to commit the slaughter while she cowers behind a veil of tears. She is waiting in the carriage outside, Julian whispered. Eleanor turned completely still. She wished to accompany me inside, Julian continued miserably, but her tears were uncontrollable. She was terrified of facing your wrath. A harsh, bitter laugh tore its way from Eleanor's throat. How profoundly tragic for her. Her suffering must be utterly unbearable. She took 2 steps toward him, closing the space between them, until Julian instinctively recoiled. You are severing our betrothal. You are casting me aside mere weeks prior to the ceremony. I will become an object of pity, the humiliated, discarded maiden whispered about in every drawing room across London. Men will presume I am fundamentally deficient, and the matrons will banish me to the edges of every ballroom. Meanwhile, you will take my closest companion as your bride. Julian pressed his eyelids shut. I shall arrange a substantial financial settlement. I will publish a declaration taking full blame upon myself, stating I am an unprincipled rogue. The Ton already knows you are an unprincipled rogue, Julian. Your gold will not salvage my social ruin. Eleanor searched his features, hunting for the steady youth she had trusted for years. Nothing remained of him, only this hollow, guilt-ridden stranger. Leave. Eleanor, please. Get out of my home. She did not scream. The absolute deadened finality in her voice proved far more chilling than any theatrical rage. Julian opened his mouth to protest, thought better of it, and bowed his head in defeat. He turned and retreated through the door. Eleanor remained alone. She listened to the heavy, reverberating thud of the front entrance slamming shut. Moving to the window, she watched through the gray sheets of rain as Julian climbed back inside his carriage. As the door clicked closed, she caught a distinct glimpse of a pale face framed by wet golden curls. Cecilia. The carriage wheels rolled away, carrying Eleanor's security, her calculated future, and her oldest friend into the rain. Behind her, the morning room door flew open. Eleanor, was that Julian departing? He did not even wait for the tea service. Lady Vance bustled into the room, waving an array of linen samples. Now concerning the table napkins, there will be no wedding, Mother Eleanor stated toward the window pane. Lady Vance froze mid-step. The fabric samples fluttered out of her grip, scattering across the carpet. What did you just say? Eleanor turned slowly, watching the confusion upon her mother's face begin to warp into mounting hysteria. Julian has dissolved the betrothal. He intends to wed Cecilia Montgomery. Her mother stared, all color draining from her complexion until she appeared spectral. She swayed where she stood, clutching the curved back of an armchair to keep from fainting. No, this is an abominable jest. The banns, the invitations are already out. It is finished. You are ruined. Lady Vance shrieked, the horrific reality finally crashing through her shock. Eleanor, you are utterly, completely ruined. Jilted on the eve of marriage for your own companion. The scandal, dear heaven, the scandal will annihilate us. We must pack the trunks tonight and flee to the country. We can never show our faces in London again. Silence. The command rang out with razor-sharp authority. Lady Vance blinked, startled into submission. Eleanor stood tall and motionless. Her pulse was hammering frantically against her ribs like a trapped bird, but within her mind reigned an icy, terrifying clarity. If she retreated to the countryside, she would simply ratify their triumph. She would become the pitiful, discarded casualty of Julian and Cecilia's grand, tragic romance. She refused to live out her years as an embarrassing footnote in their history. We are not packing, Eleanor said, her tone level and unwavering, and we are not fleeing. Tonight is the Blackwood Ball. It represents the pinnacle of the season. You cannot possibly contemplate attending. Her mother gasped, clutching her lace collar. By nightfall, Julian's announcements will have reached every gentleman's club. Society will be circling like wolves. They will tear your reputation to bloody shreds. Let them try, Eleanor answered coldly. I refuse to hide in the shadows because Julian Thornton lacks a spine. We are going to the ball, and I will look every hypocrite in that room directly in the eye. The Blackwood mansion was an imposing monument to Mayfair, excess its towering stone facade ablaze with the golden light of 3,000 wax tapers. Carriages stretched for blocks through the mist, an endless procession of polished lacquer velvet interiors and palpable social tension. Inside their own coach, the atmosphere was suffocating. Lady Vance sat rigid, clutching her beaded reticule with trembling, white-knuckled hands. She had spent the entire afternoon weeping, pleading with Eleanor to feign every ailment from consumption to a sudden fever. Eleanor had ignored every plea. She had bathed, brushed her dark hair until it possessed a mirror-like sheen, and instructed her maid to tighten her corset laces beyond reason. She eschewed the pale, demure pastels customary for debutantes and expected of a soon-to-be bride. Instead, she chose a gown of rich, arresting emerald silk. The neckline was cut severe and low, entirely devoid of frippery ruffles or lace. It was an armor crafted for a woman who sought no permission to exist. The carriage lurched to a final halt. The footman opened the door, admitting the roaring night air, the shouting coachman, the clatter of iron horseshoes, and the distant swell of a grand waltz. Eleanor Lady Vance whimpered, her voice cracking. "I beg of you, it is not too late to turn back." "Keep your head high, Mother Eleanor," replied, stepping down onto the wet cobblestones. "If you behave like prey, they will treat you like a carcass." They passed through the soaring foyer. The air was thick, with costly perfumes, crushed roses, and the distinct metallic undercurrent of nervous adrenaline. A sweeping marble staircase curved upward toward the grand ballroom. As Eleanor and her mother relinquished their velvet wraps, Eleanor registered the immediate shift in the room's temperature. A cluster of young women near the cloakroom ceased speaking instantly. Their gazes darted toward Eleanor, snapped away, and returned in frantic disbelief. One whispered feverishly behind a feathered fan. The scandal had already arrived. Eleanor maintained her chin parallel to the floorboards. Placing her gloved hand upon the polished brass handrail, she began her ascent. With every step the music swelled, yet the ambient chatter of the crowd began to die down in direct opposition. Reaching the summit, the majordomo, a towering figure in powdered wig and livery, took one look at her and hesitated. He had undoubtedly heard the rumors. He looked torn between announcing her arrival or discreetly pointing her toward the servants' stairwell. Eleanor met his eyes with absolute unwavering composure. She did not flinch. The majordomo swallowed hard, struck his ceremonial staff against the marble, and projected his voice across the chamber. "Lady Vance, Miss Eleanor Vance." For a horrifying, breathless second, the music itself seemed to stumble. The violinist did not cease, but the dancers lost their timing. The hundreds of voices conversing within the gilded room plummeted into an intense, unified hush. The sound of dozens of ivory fans fluttering in unison sounded remarkably like a flock of carrion birds taking flight. Eleanor stood framed in the arched threshold, looking out over the sea of silk diamonds and judgment. Every single face was turned toward her. She saw the dowagers, their eyes glinting with predatory glee at the unfolding disaster. She saw the young debutantes, staring with a mixture of horror and pity, terrified that her disgrace might prove contagious. She saw the gentlemen lounging against the Corinthian pillars, already calculating wagers on how many minutes would pass before she dissolved into tears. And then she found them. Standing near the heart of the ballroom beneath the central crystal chandelier were Julian and Cecilia. They had clearly never expected her to appear. Julian looked stricken with raw panic, his arm moving instinctively to shield Cecilia. And Cecilia looked radiant in a pale blue gown, a glittering diamond pendant resting against her throat, a heirloom. Eleanor recognized instantly from the Westbury vault. Cecilia went stark white upon catching sight of Eleanor. She stepped back, half concealing herself behind Julian's shoulder, her wide eyes rapidly filling with convenient, sympathetic tears. A physical blow would have been far more merciful. The staggering insolence of it to sever their betrothal that very morning and parade the new conquest that very night. It was an outright declaration of war. It was an execution of Eleanor's standing in public view. The crowd drew back, creating a vast hollow perimeter around Eleanor, a social quarantine. Not a single person approached. Not a single soul spoke. "Dear God," Lady Vance whimpered, shrinking toward the curtains. "Eleanor, they are staring. Every single eye is on us." "Let them look," Eleanor murmured. Her voice was steady, though. A cold sweat gathered at the base of her neck. Forcing her feet forward, she advanced with slow, deliberate grace. She did not scurry. She claimed an empty alcove, framed by heavy draperies, and turned to face the entire room. She refused to glance in Julian and Cecilia's direction again. She met the stares of the assembled nobility, daring anyone to challenge her gaze. No one possessed the courage. From the opposite end of the grand hall, shadowed by the folds of a heavy velvet curtain, Alexander Sterling, the Duke of Ravenswood, watched the entire spectacle unfold. He was a man who held high society in unreserved contempt. To him, the ton was merely a swarm of vapid, grasping parasites who weighed a man's existence entirely by the acreage of his holdings and the age of his lineage. He possessed both in overwhelming abundance. At 32, he remained unmarried, notoriously ruthless in commercial ventures, and armed with a cynical detachment that bordered on outright cruelty. He attended these tiresome gatherings solely to remind his political rivals of his untouchable dominance. He had caught the gossip before he had even surrendered his evening cloak. The young Westbury fool had discarded the Vance girl in favor of her frivolous blonde companion, a trite, uninspired scandal of the upper classes. He had anticipated the jilted woman would sequester herself at home, weeping into her lace pillows. Instead, she had strode into the lion's den clad in emerald silk, carrying an aura of lethal defiance. Alexander swirled the brandy in his glass, his dark eyes fixed entirely upon Eleanor. He observed the wide berth granted to her by the cowards in the room. He noted how the Westbury heir appeared physically sick with shame while the blonde girl clung to his coat like a desperate parasite. Yet what held him was Eleanor herself. She was frightened. He could perceive it in the rigid line of her spine and the faint, near-invisible tremor in the hand clutching her fan. The predators were circling, waiting for the slightest fracture in her facade to tear her name to ribbons. If she broke, if she fled, she was finished for all time. Yet she refused to yield an inch. Her chin remained lifted. Her dark eyes scanned the room with a cold, piercing intellect that exposed the hypocrisy of every coward whispering behind a fan. There was no begging for mercy in her posture, only a silent, smoldering fury. Alexander found himself deeply intrigued. He despised weakness. He respected survivors, and the woman standing across the floor was positioned at the center of an inferno refusing to burn. He noticed a young lord, a notorious rake and malicious gossip, begin to detach himself from a pillar, smirking as he crossed the floor toward Eleanor's alcove, clearly intending to deliver a humiliating insult to shatter her composure. Alexander set his tumbler down. The crystal clinked against the marble table. He never deigned to interfere in the trivial squabbles of the aristocracy. It was beneath him. But as he watched the solitary figure in emerald and the pack of hyenas salivating over her ruin, a strange dark impulse took hold. He stepped out from the shadows. Lord Pemberton, an individual whose sole occupation consisted of gathering the misfortunes of others and weaponizing them for entertainment, glided through the crowd toward the alcove. He possessed a weak chin, watery eyes, and a spitefulness masquerading as wit. Eleanor watched his approach with cold certainty. Her spine pressed firmly against the plaster wall, she adjusted her grip upon her fan bracing for the strike. Pemberton halted 3 paces away, pitching his voice so that every nearby matron would hear his words clearly. Miss Vance Pemberton drawled, his thin lips curling into a mocking smile. "What an extraordinary pleasure to find you here this evening. Though I must confess, we all presumed you would be indisposed. A sudden chill, perhaps, or an unexpected change in marital climate." A cruel chuckle rippled through the immediate onlookers. Eleanor locked her jaw. Refusing to look at her mother, who was softly weeping behind her fan, she fixed her gaze directly on Pemberton's pale eyes. "My health remains entirely robust, Lord Pemberton. I appreciate your concern, misplaced though it clearly is." Robust Pemberton savored the syllable. How commendable. One requires an exceptional constitution to weather such volatile seasons. Pray tell, did Westbury leave you the centerpieces, or did he carry the lilies away to present to his new bride? The breath vanished from Eleanor's lungs. It was a vicious, unvarnished blow. The onlookers leaned in breathless, waiting for the inevitable tears, the hysterical slap, the humiliating flight. Before Eleanor could unleash a cutting response, a massive shadow fell across Pemberton. Alexander Sterling, Duke of Ravenswood, did not simply walk, he commanded space. Tall, broad-shouldered, and attired in severe, unornamented black evening dress, his mere proximity caused an immediate physical recoil throughout the room. People scrambled backward. The malicious murmuring died, instantly replaced by a suffocating, terrified silence. Pemberton spun around, irritated by the intrusion, only to find himself staring at the Duke's stark neckcloth. He looked up, his sneer collapsing into pure, unadulterated panic. Your Grace," Pemberton squeaked, executing an awkward, trembling bow. Alexander did not deign to look at him. He examined the ceiling molding with an expression of profound boredom. "Pemberton, you are obstructing the draft. Move." I was merely paying my respects to Miss Vance, Your Grace, offering my sympathies. "Your breath smells of cheap gin and foul intentions." Alexander cut him off. His voice was not loud, but it resonated with lethal, unquestioned authority. He finally turned his dark, scarred gaze upon the younger man. "I said, move." Pemberton swallowed audibly. Looking between Eleanor and the Duke, the terrifying realization dawned upon him that he had wandered onto a battlefield far beyond his rank. He stumbled backward in haste, nearly treading on a dowager's silk train in his scramble to vanish into the crowd. Alexander watched him scurry away, then turned his complete undivided attention to Eleanor. At close quarters, the Duke of Ravenswood was imposing in a manner that transcended mere stature. His countenance was a study in uncompromising angles and aristocratic detachment, marked by a faded scar slicing through his left eyebrow that lent him a dangerous asymmetry. He did not look upon Eleanor with pity. He regarded her the way a seasoned commander might inspect a soldier who had held the line under heavy fire. An irritating parasite. Alexander murmured, his tone dropping to a quiet register intended for her ears alone. Like an insect. You would have crushed him in due course, but my patience was wearing thin. Eleanor stared at him, her heart beating wildly in her throat. She had never spoken with the Duke. Though they moved in the same sprawling circles of high society, he occupied the absolute pinnacle, a realm of kingmakers, cabinet ministers, and imperial power. I was not in need of a champion, Your Grace, Eleanor stated. Her voice carried a faint tremor, but her chin remained defiant. I am well aware, Alexander replied, his gaze dipping momentarily to her white-knuckled grip on the fan. Had you required rescue, you would not have marched into this room wearing armor designed to scorch your enemies. You are surviving. I simply expedited the matter. Stepping back, he executed a bow. It was neither a perfunctory nod nor a hurried gesture of duty. It was a deep, immaculate, technically flawless bow of profound respect. An audible gasp rippled through the grand hall. Miss Vance, Alexander said, extending a gloved hand toward her, I find myself profoundly exhausted by the sycophants in this room. Would you do me the honor of this waltz? Eleanor stared at his open hand. The sheer weight of the gesture crashed over her thoughts. To dance with the Duke of Ravenswood was no simple social pleasantry. It was an unassailable endorsement. It was an iron shield forged from the highest rank in the kingdom. If she accepted his hand, every whisper of pity would instantly morph into frantic rumors of conspiracy. How had she secured the Duke? Had she discarded Westbury for a higher prize? The entire narrative would shatter and reform in a heartbeat. She looked up into his dark eyes, searching for a hidden trap, a cruel jest, or a wager. She found only an uncompromising analytical intelligence. Why, she whispered. Because Alexander murmured, they arrived tonight, hoping to watch you bleed, and I harbor a violent distaste for giving this rabble what it wants. Eleanor slowly snapped her fan shut. Reaching outward, she placed her fingers into his grasp. His hold was warm, solid, and completely unyielding. I would be honored, Your Grace. Alexander escorted her out from the wall. The experience of crossing the ballroom floor was transformed entirely. Where before she had faced a wall of hostile stares, the crowd now parted in chaotic haste, clearing a wide path to the center of the hall. Eleanor kept her eyes fixed forward. Out of the corner of her vision, she saw faces frozen in absolute shock. Lady Jersey leaned so far forward from her sofa that she nearly lost her footing. As they reached the center of the polished floor, the musicians who had been lazily drawing their bows snapped to attention. The conductor tapped his baton, and the waltz began in earnest. Alexander turned her into the movement. He placed his right palm firmly against the small of her back, the heat radiating through the emerald silk, a grounding anchor in a room that felt as though it were spinning off its foundation. Eleanor rested her left hand upon his shoulder, feeling the coiled, powerful tension beneath his wool coat. They stepped into the turn. You are trembling, Alexander noted, his eyes locked onto her face, completely disregarding the hundreds of onlookers staring at them. I am a woman standing at the center of a social earthquake, Your Grace, Eleanor countered, fixing her eyes upon the knot of his neckcloth. A slight tremor is permissible. A reasonable defense. Alexander guided them seamlessly around an aristocrat who had frozen mid-step. Breathe, Miss Vance. The advantage is yours now. Look at them. I have little desire to look at them. Look, he commanded gently, his tone brooking no argument. Do not retreat. You paid for this ground. Now claim it. Eleanor forced her eyes upward, looking past Alexander's shoulder. As they spun, the blur of the room resolved into sharp portraits of panic. Matrons were whispering frantically behind their hands. Young lords looked entirely bewildered. Then the rhythm carried them directly past Julian and Cecilia. They were frozen near the punch table. Julian looked as though he had been struck with an iron hammer. All color had drained from his face, leaving him staring at Eleanor and the Duke with a slack, jawed expression of disbelief. Cecilia appeared even worse. The triumphant, shimmering aura of the newly claimed bride had vanished completely. her hands clutched frantically at her pale blue gown, her chest heaving as if she were suffocating. The surrounding guests who had previously swarmed the couple with congratulations were already edging away, their attention entirely captivated by the Duke. A sharp, dark thrill surged through Eleanor's veins. It was a vicious, unvarnished satisfaction, and she consumed it like cool water on a scorched afternoon. "Ah," Alexander murmured, catching the direction of her gaze. "The faithless fiancé and the treacherous companion. They look remarkably like hares caught in a snare." They looked terrified, Eleanor breathed. "As well they should. They presumed they had crushed you. It is profoundly unsettling to realize one has struck granite instead of glass." Alexander tightened his grip on her waist, slightly, drawing her an inch closer, a microscopic breach of etiquette that landed like a thunderclap in the middle of the ballroom. "Why are you doing this, truly?" Eleanor asked, pulling her gaze back to Alexander's face. "You do not know me. You owe me nothing. Intervening here offers you no social or political profit." "I have no need for social profit," Alexander stated flatly. "And you are mistaken. I know a great deal regarding you, Miss Vance. I know you managed your late father's estate ledgers with ruthless precision. I know you orchestrated a remarkably astute investment in the East India trade last winter, utilizing your solicitor to navigate around the legal restrictions placed on female capital." Eleanor stumbled in her footwork. Alexander caught her effortlessly, carrying her through the missed step without disrupting their tempo. How could you possibly know that she demanded her surprise, piercing her composure? "I make it my business to know who possesses genuine intellect in this city, rather than mere ornamental pedigree," Alexander said, the faintest ghost of a smile touching his lips. "You are calculating, Miss Vance. You are razor sharp. You did not choose Westbury out of blind, foolish romance. You selected him because he was a predictable, manageable asset." Eleanor felt a flush rise to her cheeks, stung by the cold accuracy of his assessment. "That makes me sound exceptionally heartless." "It makes you sound like a survivor," Alexander corrected. "Blind passion is a catastrophic liability. It turns men into fools. It causes them to abandon their duties and parade their treachery before the world." He nodded subtly toward Julian and Cecilia. "I despise incompetence, and I respect a mind that calculates." The tempo swelled, signaling the concluding measures of the waltz. "What happens when the music ends?" Eleanor asked, the approaching quiet weighing heavily upon her. "I remain a jilted bride. You remain the Duke. Society will assume this was a passing act of charity." "Society will assume whatever we dictate to them," Alexander replied. The waltz finished on a grand, lingering chord. Alexander brought them to a halt in the dead center of the floor. He did not let go of her hand. Stepping back, he maintained his hold upon her fingers as the room fell into complete, breathless silence. Not a single fan moved. Alexander looked down at Eleanor, his face an unreadable mask. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lifted her gloved hand toward his lips. He did not press his mouth to the fabric. He hovered a fraction of an inch above her knuckles, an ancient, fiercely intimate declaration of loyalty and public claim. Lowering her hand, he kept his fingers entwined with hers. "Miss Vance," Alexander announced, his voice carrying effortlessly to the surrounding perimeter. "I found this dance exceptionally illuminating. If you are agreeable, I should like to call upon you tomorrow afternoon. Shall we say 3 o'clock? We have significant investments to discuss." Eleanor looked up at him. He was handing her a fortress. He was gathering the broken fragments of her social standing and recasting them in iron. A genuine smile, sharp, victorious, and fully alive, curved her lips. "I would welcome that, Your Grace," Eleanor responded clearly. 3 o'clock will suit admirably." Alexander bowed once more, offered his arm, and escorted her from the center of the hall, leaving the smoldering ruins of Julian and Cecilia's triumph in their wake. Morning arrived over Mayfair with an unforgiving brightness. Inside the Vance residence, the atmosphere resembled the headquarters of a military campaign. Lady Vance had not slept a wink. She had spent the dark hours oscillating between terror that the Duke's intervention was an elaborate jest and hysterical euphoria at the thought of her daughter becoming a duchess. By midday, she had ordered the front steps scrubbed twice over, replaced every floral arrangement with ruinously expensive orchids, and driven the kitchen staff to tears over the consistency of the clotted cream. Eleanor sat in the drawing room, attired in a tailored morning gown of deep navy. She felt completely drained, yet thrumming with a strange, crackling energy. She had not merely survived the Blackwood ball, she had turned her own devastation into a weapon. At precisely 3 o'clock, the heavy brass knocker on the front door fell with a single uncompromising thud. When the butler opened the drawing room door, Alexander Sterling strode inside. In the stark daylight stripped of the soft glow of ballroom chandeliers, he appeared even more formidable. He wore a dark riding coat, tailored. Lady Vance immediately sank into a curtsy, so exaggerated she nearly lost her footing. "Your Grace, we are profoundly honored. May I offer you tea or perhaps port or—" "He is adequate." Lady Vance Alexander cut in polite, yet completely dismissive. His dark eyes moved past her to Eleanor. "Miss Vance." "Your Grace." Eleanor remained seated for a deliberate second longer than propriety, demanded asserting her composure before rising to offer a measured curtsy. "I prefer to take my tea without the presence of a chaperone," Lady Vance Alexander stated. The phrasing was framed as a request, but the delivery carried the absolute weight of a royal decree. Lady Vance gasped, her eyes darting frantically between them. Propriety demanded she stay. Ambition demanded she vanish. Ambition prevailed instantly. "Of course, Your Grace. I shall leave you to discuss your investments." She practically fled the room, pulling the heavy oak door shut until it latched firmly. A profound quiet settled over the room. Alexander did not take a seat immediately. He paced slowly along the perimeter, his sharp eyes cataloging the furnishings, the leather-bound volumes on the tables, and the total absence of frivolous trinkets. "Your mother is an exceptionally nervous creature," he remarked, pausing by the window to survey the street below. "She spent yesterday convinced she would die in destitute obscurity, and today she imagines herself dining with royalty," Eleanor replied dryly. "The whiplash is understandable." Alexander turned the faintest trace of amusement lingering at the corner of his mouth. He crossed to the armchair facing hers, sat down, and crossed one long leg over the other, appearing entirely in command of a room he did not own. "Be seated, Miss Vance." Eleanor sat, keeping her posture perfectly upright, her hands folded loosely in her lap. "You stated you wished to discuss investments, Your Grace. I trust we are not genuinely reviewing the East India Company. No. We are discussing the investment of our combined futures." Alexander leaned back, steepling his long fingers. "I am 32 years of age. My ducal title is an ancient burden that demands an heir. My estates stretch across 3 separate counties and require relentless, meticulous management. Society demands that I marry, and their endless attempts to parade vapid, giggling girls before me have grown utterly intolerable." Eleanor observed him with careful focus. "You are proposing a formal arrangement." "I am proposing a merger." Alexander held her gaze without wavering. "I do not seek a love match, Miss Vance. I consider the concept exhausting and inherently unstable, as you yourself discovered yesterday morning. I require a partner. I want a woman possessing the intellect to manage my estates without bringing trivial domestic panics to my desk. I want a partner whose nerve will not shatter when political rivals smell blood. I watched you last night. You marched directly into a firing line and refused a blindfold." Eleanor swallowed against the sudden tightness in her throat. No man had ever addressed her in such terms. Men like Julian wrapped their expectations in soft, patronizing declarations of affection. Alexander was stripping away the velvet and laying the naked iron upon the table. "You offer me protection," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "An impenetrable shield against the scandal Julian manufactured." "I offer you an empire," Alexander corrected softly. "Scandal cannot touch the Duchess of Ravenswood. The entire ton will bow before you. They will choke on their own gossip. In return, I demand absolute loyalty. We present an unbreakable, unified front to the world. We do not waver, and we do not indulge in petty games of jealousy or spite. Is that understood?" "I have no patience for petty games," Eleanor replied. She looked at her hands for a fleeting second, then met his piercing stare once more. "Yet I require one answer. Why me? Surely there are women of higher pedigree and entirely untarnished reputations." Alexander leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, closing the distance between them until the intensity of his presence was almost overwhelming. "Because, Miss Vance, those women bore me to distraction," he said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant rumble. "They are predictable. They are trained from childhood to be decorative fixtures in a parlor. You possess sharp edges and cold calculation. I do not desire an ornament. I want a queen on my chessboard who understands when to sacrifice a pawn to claim a rook. You comprehend survival. So do I." He reached into his breast pocket and produced a small velvet box, placing it onto the low table between them. He did not open it. "I depart for my northern seat in 3 weeks," Alexander stated. "I intend to travel with a wife. I will secure the special license. I will handle your former fiancé and the rumors. You will oversee my estates and our public standing. He tapped the velvet surface once. Do we have an agreement, Eleanor? It was the first time he had spoken her Christian name. The sound of it on his lips was blunt, devoid of the soft sentimentality Julian had always feigned. It sounded permanent. Eleanor looked down at the box. She pictured Cecilia's weeping, guilty expression. She recalled Julian's weak, evasive eyes. She weighed the lifetime of condescending pity she would endure if she walked away. She reached forward and laid her palm flat over the box. We have an agreement, Alexander. Hyde Park at 4 p.m. was not a mere leisure ground. It was an open-air arena where social hierarchy was aggressively contested. Carriages moved in a deliberate, slow procession along Rotten Row, permitting the occupants to inspect and be inspected, to acknowledge allies and annihilate rivals with a pointedly turned parasol. 2 days following Alexander's visit, Eleanor sat beside him in his open phaeton. The carriage was an exhibition of masterfully understated power, gleaming black lacquer, polished silver fittings drawn by a pair of massive, matched gray geldings. Alexander drove the team himself, his gloved hands controlling the reins with effortless, terrifying skill. The afternoon air was brisk, carrying the deceptive brightness of late spring. Eleanor wore a carriage ensemble of rich burgundy velvet, a matching hat framing her dark hair. Resting upon her left hand was the enormous square-cut sapphire, an ancient heavy stone that utterly eclipsed the modest diamond ring Julian had once given her. As the phaeton passed through the park gates, the reaction of the crowd was immediate. Heads turned so sharply, Eleanor wondered if bones might crack. Carriages slowed to a crawl. Pedestrians halted mid-step on the gravel paths. Keep your chin steady, Alexander murmured, his eyes trained on the horses ahead. He offered no nod to the staring onlookers. He drove like a sovereign surveying conquered territory. I am entirely steady, Eleanor replied, though her pulse raced beneath her cuffs. Good. Let them gape. This is how we establish the new order. They completed one slow circuit of the park. Eleanor felt the intoxicating weight of Alexander's standing beside her. Figures who would have cut her dead 3 days prior were now desperately attempting to catch her eye, praying for the slightest nod of recognition. The social tide had not simply shifted. It had completely reversed direction. As they began their second pass, a carriage bottleneck near the Serpentine brought their horses to a temporary halt. Eleanor glanced toward the walking path to their left, and the breath caught in her throat. Standing scarcely 10 paces away, caught in the crush of the crowd, were Julian and Cecilia. They were walking arm in arm. Cecilia wore an elaborate bonnet, laden with pink ribbons, but the bright color failed to conceal the exhaustion etched around her eyes. Julian appeared haggard, his shoulders slumped, robbed of his usual jaunty confidence. The social isolation they had attempted to inflict upon Eleanor had turned violently upon themselves. The surrounding pedestrians maintained a cold, noticeable distance, their eyes darting between the disgraced pair on foot and the commanding couple in the phaeton. Julian spotted her first. He froze instantly, his grip on Cecilia's arm tightening so abruptly that she winced and looked up. Cecilia's gaze locked onto Eleanor. Her eyes widened in shock, sweeping from Eleanor's serene expression down to the massive sapphire resting against the dark velvet of her skirt. A chaotic storm of emotion flickered across Cecilia's face: disbelief, sharp envy, and a desperate, pathetic plea. Before Julian could restrain her, Cecilia broke away and took 3 hurried steps toward the carriage. Eleanor, Cecilia, cried, her voice breathless and trembling with rehearsed vulnerability. Eleanor, please. Beside her, Alexander shifted. He did not look at Cecilia. He merely tightened his hold on the leather reins, the harness creaking in the sudden dead quiet that fell over the path. Eleanor looked down at her former companion. She felt no lingering rage. The fire of the ballroom had burned itself out, leaving behind only cold, crystal clarity. Miss Montgomery. Eleanor spoke her words, carrying effortlessly through the crisp air, polite, yet entirely devoid of warmth. Cecilia flinched at the formal address, tears immediately springing to her eyes. Please, Nora. Do not address me so coldly. I know I have caused you pain. I have not slept since that terrible morning. I want to explain everything. I want us to be as we were. Can you not find it in your heart to forgive us? It was a calculated, manipulative appeal, delivered straight to the surrounding audience of onlookers. Had Eleanor lashed out, she would be branded a bitter shrew. Had she offered forgiveness, she would have absolved their guilt and diminished her own power. Eleanor leaned slightly forward, resting her sapphire-clad hand upon the polished edge of the phaeton. She regarded Cecilia with the cool curiosity of a naturalist observing a specimen. "Explain," Eleanor asked smoothly. "What remains to be explained, Miss Montgomery? You desired my betrothed. He proved weak enough to be easily taken. It is an exceedingly simple transaction. I have no need for explanations regarding cheap things." Julian let out a choked sound of indignation, stepping forward to intervene. "Now see here, Eleanor. There is no call to be cruel." "Silence," Alexander commanded. It was a single, quietly spoken word, yet it cut through the afternoon air like a guillotine. Julian's jaw snapped, shut his face, flushing crimson as he encountered the Duke's flat, dead-eyed stare. Alexander did not raise his voice. He simply looked at Julian, as though calculating precisely where to strike. Cecilia was openly sobbing, now her shoulders shaking. "I only wanted my friend back," she wept. "I am not your friend," Eleanor said, maintaining the same lethal, quiet composure as Alexander. "And you are not my enemy, Cecilia. You are simply nothing to me. You are a stranger whose poor choices are no longer my concern." Eleanor settled back against the leather cushions, turning her eyes forward. "Drive on Alexander, if you please. The air here has grown remarkably stale." Alexander's lips twitched with grim amusement. He flicked the reins, and the gray geldings surged forward, the wheels rolling away smoothly, and leaving Julian and Cecilia standing in the gravel dust, surrounded by the mocking stares of the elite. Eleanor did not look back. She felt Alexander's gaze upon her profile. "Cheap things," Alexander repeated softly, a thread of dark admiration in his voice. "Flawlessly delivered, my dear." Eleanor looked at him, feeling a new sensation spark within her chest. It was not gentle romance. It was something far sharper and infinitely more dangerous, absolute mutual respect. She had found a man who did not ask her to soften her edges, but rather demanded that she sharpen them. "I learned from watching you," Eleanor answered, a genuine, unforced smile touching her lips. Alexander let out a short, rough laugh that startled a passing coachman. "I suspect, Eleanor, that we are going to make a terrifyingly effective partnership." Street Martin in the Fields was vast, echoing, and completely devoid of lilies. The reading of banns was bypassed entirely. Alexander had secured a special license with a single tersely worded letter to the Archbishop, calling in a political debt owed to the Sterling family for over a decade. There were no gilded invitations, nor was there an extravagant wedding breakfast prepared for hundreds of judgmental guests. Eleanor stood before the stone altar attired in a gown of heavy ivory silk, stark and elegant, completely unadorned by lace or seed pearls. Beside her stood Alexander, austere and towering in charcoal wool. The sole witnesses consisted of a weeping Lady Vance in the front pew and Alexander's chief solicitor, a man possessing the emotional warmth of a ledger book. The vicar's voice echoed off the empty stone arches, sounding remarkably small. Eleanor kept her eyes upon the altar cross, feeling a fleeting memory of the wedding she had once planned. Julian would have stood there, sweating through his collar, offering that malleable, uncertain affection surrounded by the suffocating judgment of the ton. She felt nothing but overwhelming relief that such a future was dead. "I, Alexander Charles Edward, take thee, Eleanor." Alexander's vows did not echo. They grounded the stone hall. He spoke not with theatrical sentiment, but with the gravity of a sovereign swearing an oath of state. He was ratifying an empire. When the moment came for the ring, his hands were perfectly steady. Taking her left hand, his thumb brushed firmly across her knuckles, before sliding a heavy band of unadorned Welsh gold onto her finger. It came to rest beside the great sapphire, heavy, solid, and permanent. "I, Eleanor, take thee, Alexander." Her voice rang clear through the nave, refusing to waver. She looked directly into his dark, focused eyes. There was no hesitation within him. He was a man who carved his choices into stone. The vicar pronounced them husband and wife. There was no sweeping, sentimental embrace. Alexander simply bowed his head, raised her hand to his lips, and pressed a firm, lingering kiss against the gold band he had just bestowed upon her. An hour later, they were traveling northward in a heavy ducal coach, leaving the London sprawl behind for the open countryside. Lady Vance had remained in the capital, armed with a generous allowance and strict instructions from Alexander to retire to a townhouse in Bath until the gossip had fully burned itself out. Inside the coach, the silence stretched comfortably free from the suffocating dread of her final meeting with Julian. "You did not waver," Alexander observed, leaning back against the velvet cushions, studying her. "Did you anticipate that I would?" Eleanor asked, unpinning her travel bonnet and setting it aside. She ran her fingers through her hair, exhaling a long, steady breath. Most would have. The reality of binding oneself to a formidable stranger usually strikes hardest at the altar. Alexander unbuttoned his outer coat, relaxing his posture. I am not an uncomplicated man, Eleanor. I am exacting, frequently consumed by affairs of state, and possess a temperament most find abrasive. I survived a mother whose nerves required constant management, and a betrothed whose backbone was constructed of wet paper. Eleanor replied without hesitation. I am entirely confident in my ability to manage an exacting man. Alexander let out a low, appreciative laugh. I pity anyone foolish enough to underestimate you, Duchess. The title sent a sharp, exhilarating jolt through her veins. Duchess. It was no longer a strategic ploy to crush Julian and Cecilia. It was her reality. London will dismantle them, you understand, Alexander said, turning his gaze toward the rolling fields outside. Westbury and his bride. The Ton forgives many sins, but they despise a scandal that yields no further entertainment. Now that you have placed yourself entirely out of their reach, the narrative will sour. Julian will not be remembered as a romantic hero. He will be remembered as the fool who threw away a duchess. I know, Eleanor said, looking down at the gold band on her finger. I felt the change in the park. They are already suffocating under the weight of it. Does it trouble your conscience? She looked up, searching her thoughts for any lingering sorrow or residual affection for the companion of her youth. She found only clean, cold detachment. No, Eleanor answered truthfully, it does not. Alexander nodded in deep satisfaction. Reaching across the carriage, he took her hand in his firm, uncompromising grip, holding it securely as the coach rattled toward the north. Autumn stripped the foliage from the ancient oaks surrounding Ravenswood Abbey, transforming the vast estate into a majestic fortress of gray stone beneath a pale sky. Eleanor sat behind the sprawling mahogany desk in the estate office, 3 heavy account ledgers open before her. In the 4 months since her arrival at Ravenswood, she had methodically dismantled the bloated, inefficient management left behind by the prior steward. She did not spend her afternoons painting watercolors or stitching cushions. She managed tenant leases, audited mining revenues from the northern properties, and slashed unnecessary household expenditures by 20%. The heavy door opened, and Alexander entered bringing the scent of crisp autumn wind and leather with him. He had been inspecting the southern perimeter since sunrise. Crossing the room, he came to stand behind her chair, leaning over to inspect the open ledger. You located the discrepancy in the grain accounts, he murmured, his voice low beside her ear. The bailiff in the lower valley has been siphoning 5% of the yield for 3 years, Eleanor said, tapping her quill against the ink column. I have prepared his dismissal papers. I also informed the magistrate we would forego formal charges provided he vacates the county by week's end. Thorough, Alexander murmured. He placed his hands upon her shoulders, his thumbs pressing into the tight muscles at the base of her neck, methodically working away the tension. Eleanor leaned back into his grasp, closing her eyes for a brief moment. Their union had not been built upon the frantic, fleeting poetry of romantic novels. It was grounded upon absolute, unshakable capability. They operated as a single, devastating unit. Alexander commanded the political arena, the House of Lords, and the vast strategies of his empire, while Eleanor governed the infrastructure, the finances, and the daily administration of the ducal holdings. From that mutual respect, something far deeper, fiercer, and more consuming had taken root between them. Word arrived from London this morning, Alexander said, his hands continuing their steady pressure. From my solicitor. It appears Lord Westbury is listing his hunting lodge in Hampshire for sale. Eleanor opened her eyes, setting her pen aside. Are his debts truly that catastrophic? His gambling losses have mounted rapidly, Alexander told her in a detached tone. And his new Viscountess has developed an extravagant taste for Parisian silks, in a desperate attempt to buy her way back into the favor of society matrons. They are failing completely. The doors of Mayfair remain barred to them. It appears a stolen betrothal is a poor substitute for an unblemished reputation. Eleanor looked out the high arched windows toward the sweeping hills of Ravenswood. She recalled Cecilia's weeping face in Hyde Park, and Julian's pale, panicked eyes in the morning parlor. It felt like an ancient tale that had happened to a different, far weaker woman. He will lose the ancestral estate within 5 years if he does not curtail his habits, Eleanor calculated coolly. Undoubtedly, Alexander agreed. Moving around the desk, he leaned against the mahogany edge, folding his arms as he looked down at her. Does the Duchess of Ravenswood wish to purchase the Westbury estate when it is inevitably forced to auction? Eleanor met his gaze, seeing the dark amusement and predatory loyalty gleaming in his eyes. She knew he would buy Julian's ancestral home without a second thought, and hand her the deed simply to watch her burn it, if that was what she commanded. She smiled a slow, razor-sharp expression. "I have no interest in ruined properties, Alexander. Let them rot in the ruin they built for themselves." Alexander's eyes darkened with fierce approval. Reaching down, he cupped her chin, tilting her face upward. "You are magnificent," he said softly. It was no empty flattery. It was an absolute statement of fact. He leaned down and kissed her, not with the restrained formality of their wedding day, but with a deep, possessive hunger that took her breath away. Eleanor returned the kiss, her hands gripping the lapels of his riding coat, feeling the strong, steady rhythm of his heart beneath her palms. There were no flowery speeches. There were no tears. They had no need for such trivialities. Julian and Cecilia had pursued an illusion of romance, and it was reducing their lives to ash. Eleanor had chosen pragmatism and the cold logic of survival. In doing so, she had secured an empire, crushed her adversaries without raising a finger, and found a man who looked upon her sharpest, most calculating edges and saw only his queen. The Tun had assembled expecting a tragedy. Instead, they had forged an untouchable dynasty. Thank you for watching this story. If Eleanor's cold, calculating vengeance and her incredible rise to power kept you hooked until the very last word, please hit that like button to let us know. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who loves a fiercely intelligent heroine turning a devastating betrayal into an absolute triumph. Subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our upcoming historical dramas, scandalous romances, and tales of sweet revenge. Drop a comment below. Would you have accepted the Duke's bargain? See you in the next video. The story touched me deeply because Eleanor's greatest victory was not simply defeating the people who betrayed her, but refusing to let their betrayal destroy the rest of her life. As we grow older, we come to understand that sometimes the people we trust most can disappoint us in ways we never imagined. It hurts, especially when the betrayal comes from a longtime friend or someone we once planned our future around. But there is an important lesson here. Never allow someone else's poor choices to become the measure of your own worth. You cannot control who leaves, who lies, or who chooses someone else. What you can control is what you do afterward. You can walk away with dignity, protect your peace, and begin building a life that no longer depends on their approval. And perhaps this becomes even more important as we get older. We have already spent enough years worrying about what society thinks, trying to please people, and holding on to relationships simply because they have existed for a long time. We should not spend our remaining years carrying resentment for people who chose to hurt us. Sometimes the best revenge is not revenge at all. It is waking up one morning and realizing that you are genuinely happy without them. Keep your heart kind, but keep your boundaries strong. Forgive when it brings you peace, but never confuse forgiveness with allowing someone to hurt you again. Life is too precious to spend it looking back at people who chose to walk away. To all my dear friends, especially those who have lived long enough to experience disappointment, loss, and betrayal, please remember that starting over has no age limit. Your story is not finished simply because someone else walked out of it. There can still be friendship, purpose, laughter, love, and beautiful surprises waiting ahead. Protect your peace value, the people who truly stand beside you, and never forget that your dignity is something no one else has the power to take away.